Good afternoon. My name is Claire McElroy, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for the Whatcom County Library System, and I also serve on the steering committee for Whatcom Reads. So thank you for joining us again on this beautiful day. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge that although this event is taking place online, Whatcom County Library System's buildings are on the ancestral homeland of the Nooksack, Lummi, and other Coast Salish peoples. They are the original inhabitants of this place. They are fishers, hunters, gatherers, and harvesters of nature's abundance and have been so since time immemorial. We are neighbors and friends, and we are grateful for our numerous opportunities to learn, live, and grow together, building lasting relationships so that all may prosper. So, thank you all for coming to an event in the Whatcom Reads program series. A few words about Whatcom Reads, our community-wide reading program, is since its beginning in 2009, Whatcom Reads has been a team effort with representatives from Bellingham Public Library, Bellingham Technical College, Northwest Indian College, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, Whatcom County Library System, and of course, our independent bookstore, Village Books in Bellingham and Linden, Washington. Each year, the Whatcom Reads Selection Committee picks a book for all of us to read across the county, and the 2025 selection is No Two Persons. That book right there by Erica Bauermeister. Whatcom Reads culminates in a visit from the author, and Erica will be here in person March 12th through 15th, doing events across Whatcom County. But leading up to the programs with Erica, we like to offer programming that ties to themes that are in the book. And today's event is one of those events. No Two Persons is a novel about a novel. The central book touches the lives of 9 people in different ways, but they all experience healing in a variety of ways. No Two Persons illustrates how books have the power to heal us. And today, our guests are going to discuss the practice of using books in a therapeutic way, which is bibliotherapy. Throughout today's discussion, if you have a question for Emely Rumble, our guest, during the course of the event, please do pop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find the Q&A function, you can put them in the chat. We'll see them there too. And we'll get to as many questions as we can in the hour that we have. And now a little bit about our guests. Emely Rumble, LCSW, is a distinguished licensed clinical social worker, school social worker, and seasoned bibliotherapist and psychotherapist with over 14 years of professional experience. Committed to making mental health services more accessible, Emely specializes in the transformative practice of bibliotherapy. Passionate about advocating for the integration of creative arts and psychotherapy, mental well-being, and self-improvement, Emely champions the social model of disability and embraces a neurodiversity-affirming therapeutic approach. A distinguished member of the National Association of Poetry Therapy, Emely's work has been featured in respected publications such as Parents Magazine, School Library Journal, Bold Journey Magazine, BronxNet News, Success Magazine, and The Bronx Is Reading. Her debut book, Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, releases on April 29th, 2025 with Row House Publishing. Emely is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College and Smith College School for Social Work, and she's joining us all the way from Massachusetts, where she lives with her family, which includes a psychiatric service dog named Montana. Welcome, Emely. And here to interview Emely is Meagan Wheeler. Meagan is a PSA on our mobile services team with Whatcom County Library System and is our new librarian for the Jail Library Service Program. She's currently pursuing a graduate degree in counseling, and her research focuses on somatic and creative interventions, including bibliotherapy. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Emely Rumble and Meagan Wheeler. Okay. I am going to exit stage left and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today. You could be anywhere in the world and you chose to be here with us in community discussing our favorite thing, literature. And I want to just give a brief introduction before me and Megan get into some of the nitty-gritty around what makes no two persons so healing. We're going to talk about the way that we heal when we read fiction in particular, because No Two Persons is a fictional book that really speaks to the power of what happens when we emotionally connect to stories. My name is Emely Rumble. I'm the founder of Literacy NYC, and that is my bibliotherapy practice. So we'll talk a little bit about how I engage my clients in a healing journey using books. So, what is bibliotherapy? The American Library Association officially defined what bibliotherapy is in 1966. Bibliotherapy is the use of literature to support emotional well being, self reflection, and healing. Now, healing can look a lot of different ways, right? Sometimes healing is just being able to make it from one life transition to another stage. Sometimes healing is accepting the loss of the thing that we're struggling to accept. Sometimes healing is the changes that we go through on our own personal insular journeys. What reading does is it helps us to turn inward, to really look at what we need, what we're feeling, what we're going through, maybe even what we needed that we didn't get. We can regard our emotional wounds with so much compassion when we can look at our experiences through the lens of a fictional character. How does it work? Books help readers to process our emotions. We live in a society where everything is so production driven. The world is moving fast, right? And so we know as readers that when we pick up a book, life just tends to slow down. We get to have a pause. We get to have a moment where we can just be. And for some, it's a literary escape. For others, it's reading to learn something new. And for some readers, it's a little bit of both, depending on your preferred genres and your reading preferences. But overall, when we read, we're gaining new insights. We're able to allow an emotional response to happen. I know we've all been there when we connect deeply to a story and we can't put it down. We're up into the wee hours. We regret it the next day at work because we're tired. But there's just something about this book, and we just need to know how it ends, right? It also brings our awareness to our thoughts. Like, what do I think about what's happening in the text? What do I hope will happen in the text? Sometimes when we end a book, we're so glad that the outcome was a hopeful one. And sometimes when we end a book, we're mourning because we really didn't want it to end, or we feel extremely disappointed with the way that the story ended. These are all examples of how, when we emotionally connect to a text, we experience a level of release and catharsis. So when we're reading, we get to explore new perspectives. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop says books are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Mirrors that hold up our reflection where we can see ourselves more clearly, windows where we get to look at someone else's life and consider a different perspective, and sliding glass doors where we get to step into another person's shoes and experience life through their experience. The key idea here is that no two people read the same book in the same way. Each reader finds their own meaning. We all have different intersectional identities. We all have different life experiences. We come from different identities and cultural backgrounds. We have different values. And so when we're reading a book, we're bringing ourselves to the book. And there's a rich history here of the bibliotherapy tradition that talks about this. So if you're interested in learning more, check out the work of bibliotherapists like Ella Berthoud, Susan Elderkin, and you'll learn more about this in bibliotherapy in the Bronx as well. So the core concept in No Two Persons is essentially that, well, let's read the quote. That was the beauty of books, wasn't it? They took you to places you didn't know you needed to go. So it's one book, nine readers, 10 changed lives. Each person connects with the story differently based on their own unique life experiences. And I love this book because I love the way that the author takes her time in showing us who these characters are, showing us their place in society, showing us their deepest hurts and regrets, their grief, right? The things that they're currently grappling with emotionally, and the moment that they connect with the book Theo, the way that it changes them. So we can immediately see what the emotional wound is and how connecting with Theo's story provides a balm for that wound. So, how do stories become therapy? In this book, Alice is the author, and she pours her emotions into her novel after losing her brother. She writes Theo when she's pretty young, she's in her mid-20s. And so the readers interacting with her text find their own personal healing through her words. And how ironic, right? That she's going through her own grief journey, facing tons of rejections, not really sure that her book will land the way that it she hopes it would, right? And then we find a homeless teenager who finds comfort and hope, a deep diver who processes grief and endurance, an artist who channels anger into creativity, a bookseller who's yearning for love and connection. The lesson is that stories meet us exactly where we are in our lives. Stories offer us meaning and insight in unexpected ways. And this is a really core part of the healing journey because when we talk about reading to heal, we're really talking about meaning making. And a crucial part of healing is allowing us to reshape our personal stories in ways that affirm us, in ways that demonstrate our strengths and our humanity. And that's what bibliotherapy is all about. So let's get into the personal impact of books, right? When we read, we're self-reflecting, we're looking at our thought life, we're practicing thought hygiene, we're saying, oh, it's a moment of simulation. If I were in this situation, if I were this character, would I have responded in the same way? Maybe we begin to think about ourselves and consider, what is my communication style or my conflict resolution style? We can either see or not see ourselves in the text, and that provides a moment even of emotional catharsis. It builds empathy and understanding not only towards the self, but towards others. Reading inspires growth and healing. So, an example from No Two Persons is that the widower, lost in grief, finds solace in Alice's novel, helping him move forward, right? It's hard. Any of us who have been touched by loss, and we all will at some point along a life path, right, knows that the hardest thing about losing someone that you love is figuring out how can I go on living without them. And so I love that theme is such a, the theme of grief, rather, in this book is such a main component of how these characters heal and are able to find strength to move on. So, some reflection questions after reading this book, if I were to use this in bibliotherapy with a client, which I have, is what emotions did this book bring up for you? Did any character's journey mirror your own experiences? What insights did the book provide about your own life? How did the book help shift your perspective or offer you clarity? I always tell my bibliotherapy clients to keep a reading journal. Even if you're not really big on pen to paper, you can save a voice note for every book that you read so that when you have a moment of emotional release, an insight, or just a cathartic moment, you can share that and keep track of that because it also will give you some insight into what you're feeling and what's coming up for you to make some really meaningful connections. So, No Two Persons is a powerful book because it shows that books do not have one single meaning. Each reader takes away something unique. Books are so much more than stories, they're tools for healing, transformation, and connection. And so, as me and Megan talk today, I want you to reflect on a book that changed you. Maybe it's No Two Persons, maybe there are others. How did these books shape your perspective or help you heal? And again, my name's Emely Rumble. You can connect with me at _NYC on social media platforms. And my book, Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, comes out in April on April 29th. And I hope that you'll consider reading it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is really great. Give us a little background on bibliotherapy. Um, let's jump in. We were just
Do
talking before
it.
everybody else was invited in with us about our not necessarily favorite characters, but those characters that resonated the most with us. And you shared earlier this week for our WCLS social media accounts about how Alice's professor really spoke to you. He tells her, "Write the thing you're meant to write, Alice." Will you tell us more about what spoke to you in that character?
Yeah. When we meet Alice, she's a little bit unsure, right? Of like her gifts as a writer. She feels like it's a science kind of to be studied, or there's certain things that she needs to learn to perfect, to write the perfect sentences. And she's kind of in her head about it. And I think when she engages her professor around writing this book, he reminds her that, yes, there's like technique and there's different things to consider around the science of writing, but that we all have a story to tell. So just tell the story that's inside of you. Move from your head to your heart and just write. And I think that that's so important because, we all do have a story to tell and all of our stories matter. And sometimes we allow our own self-consciousness to get in the way of that. And some of us just struggle with really believing that anybody would care if we wrote a story, or if we told our story. And so I think it's really important, like that moment where her professor not only pours into her, but he follows up with her after because she tries to kind of like disappear. And then um, she ends up building a rapport with his wife, comes to the house for dinner, and he's like, "Hey, how's it going? Are you still writing?" And that moment where he tells her, go to a coffee shop and listen. Just listen to what's going on around you to understand how people are feeling. That's such a beautiful skill. Like how many of us are actively listening, not just to like the world around us, but like to ourselves. And I also think that like a rich reading practice does that for us. It offers us that stillness where we get to like turn inward and listen to self. So I feel like that writer's journey is a two-part process of like really listening to what the story is inside of you that needs to be told and being able to like listen to um what's going on around you in order to understand like who your audience is and how you want to tell it. I could go on and on about the
Yeah.
professor, but yeah, I love the
Yeah.
professor.
The focus on feelings and even it comes back to her at the end of the book and she's talking about how that art piece just opens her up. It's like suddenly that story appears again and she gets in touch with that. So it's developing that self-awareness and that understanding and letting the kind of becoming a channel for what's around you and what's inside of you. I loved that too.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, let's talk about timing because timing it feels like such um, a crucial
yeah.
piece of your whole process, I imagine. Um, it it is so important to how somebody experiences a story, whether that's the first time reading it or whether they are revisiting it after years away from it. Could you speak to the importance of timing as a story enters somebody's life, and maybe if there's a story or a book that you've read and come back to, and it's the meaning has changed for you, if you could talk about that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Timing is everything, right? Like the point at which you come to a story. I think that a book that maybe doesn't resonate with you today might really speak to you in a deep way, like next year or 5 years from now. And that's why timing is so important because I think of books like The House on Mango Street, reading it as a teenager, it was like, oh, okay, this is like a coming of age story. Um, and it was very like, for me, the vignettes were very like charming and that was it. But going back to it, in my 30s, after motherhood, I read that story with so much more complexity and nuance. Like I actually take my time with each vignette. The writing is so beautiful in that book. Um, Me reading it in my 30s, I saw it differently. I felt like it was a meditation on identity, on displacement, on the burden of carrying your ancestors' stories. Like I've done so much work with the house on Mango Street, especially in family therapy. And I actually have a case study in bibliotherapy in the Bronx, based on this book because I love this book so much. I used to have two copies in my office, one in English and one in Spanish. Um, but that's sort of one example of a book that I've reread maybe like 4 times. And every time I read it, I come away with something new. I think when we revisit books too that we loved at a younger age, like it reveals how much we've changed and how much we've grown and just how much our perspective has shifted because we've got some new life experiences under our belt. We've taken a few hits, right? Like we're less naive. Our perspectives have widened and literature just meets us in so many different ways throughout our lives that it's so exciting to think about like timing And I also think of like my bookshelf as a medicine cabinet. So I think of it that way as like, if you have a prescription, usually it's like a 7-day prescription. And then that's it. It's like a problem to be solved. You take your medicine and you're supposed to feel better. And I feel like with books, it's similar because everybody has a different ailment and everybody needs based on their own, you know, psychology and reading preferences, a different sort of literature to delve into to ease the pain or provide an escape or provide an adventure or a little bit of fun. So timing to me is really central to the work that I do as a bibliotherapist who prescribes books.
Yeah, I love that. I'm hoping, Claire, that we can keep a list and maybe post that once the recording is available too, because I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of good titles that come up. Um, could we maybe, you mentioned the prescription and how it's like a um your medicine cabinet of books. Could we jump into a couple of scenarios and get us some more of these prescriptions available for whatever everybody is needing right now?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so in one of your last interviews, I told you I'd been listening to every podcast that you'd done. If everybody else is interested, go search in whatever podcast player you use because there's a lot of them and they're all like so juicy and so much good information. Like I was in tears a lot of the time. Uh,
I'm
okay,
always in tears, Megan. I'm surprised I'm not crying already talking to you because I'm always in tears.
books. That's a lot of
Yes.
action too being together. Okay, so you mentioned the three P's of bibliotherapy. And I think you're going to talk about this in your book that's coming
Yes.
out in next month too. So problem, preferences, and prescription. Could you give us a little more about that? Like, what do you like to know? What do you ask people when you're looking to fill in those
Yeah.
blanks?
Yeah, well, in true, therapist fashion, we always want to know what brings you to therapy. So, like for some people, it's I'm so anxious, I'm having panic attacks every week. For others, it's, my mother just passed away and I'm just in shambles. How am I supposed to function and like go to work, right? There's so many different reasons that someone would be driven to pursue going to therapy. Because for the most part, people, it's not like people are just like, hey, I want to go to therapy. But I think also with the current state of our society, people are realizing like, oh, I need some mental health support. So I always like to ask what brings you to therapy because I want to understand the way that the client is framing their problem. That's going to give me some insight into like how I can help you essentially because everybody defines the problem differently, right? So even for someone who's struggling with anxiety, the problem might be I just want to stop having nightmares, right? They can like function for the most part, but they can't sleep, right? For another person, the anxiety might be, like I said earlier, I'm actually like physically responding to my anxiety and I'm having panic attacks. I can't breathe. I'm on the road and I'm having an episode. Like it's interfering with my day-to-day life, right? So me understanding the problem helps me to conduct a interview with the client to understand the history of the problem, the frequency of the symptoms, what the symptoms are, the intensity and the duration. I'm kind of getting a sense of what the struggle is, how it's impacting you, so that I can better understand like, is bibliotherapy even an intervention that could support you, right? Because for more like severe and persistent mental illness, we can certainly read a book, but that's not going to help like some of the more severe mental health symptomatology. So I have to kind of understand what the problem is before I can decide how best to serve a client. And then preferences is once I've decided that bibliotherapy would actually be a wonderful creative intervention for us, I want to understand who you are as a reader. Because for some people, they're like, oh, this is really interesting. And I do consider myself creative and I miss being creative. Or when I was a young person, I loved to write poems or do spoken word or write. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe we can tap back into that younger self by trying some bibliotherapy. But maybe they're not someone who reads novels every week, right? So I want to know who you are as a reader. Do you read as a care practice? If you do, what do you like to read? What kinds of books are you drawn to? Do you have auto buy authors who, no matter what what they write. You're buying it, you're reading it, right? Like, what genres do you prefer? What format do you like to read in, right? Like, are you a physical book person, an audiobook person? How do you like to physically interact with your books? Like, there's some people who would never a day in their life dog ear pages. There's some people who really love to annotate as a way to engage with the text and really take in that emotional experience of like pulling out themes and book quotes and things like that. So I want to know how my client engages with books so that we can engage with the book together, right? Like it's an emotional journey that I'm on with you. So if you like to engage with your book physically, then I'm going to do that. If it makes you cringe to dog ear a page, then maybe I need to know that because I love to dog ear. So it's also like, therapy is the relationship between therapist and client. So me knowing how you like to read helps me be the best bibliotherapist for you that I can be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm always considering, right, the intersectional identity of a person. And that's not to say that like if you're queer, you only read queer authors. If you're Black, you only read Black authors. Like everybody is different, right? So I want to know a little bit about your intersectional identity and what your preferences are so that I can just make sure that I'm going to prescribe a book that's actually going to resonate with you, that you're actually going to want to read. And then next it will be prescription. Once I know what the problem is, I have an idea kind of how we want to go about trying to solve it or find creative solutions to it, then we're gonna really hone down on those preferences. And then using all of that information, I'm going to make the best prescription possible. And I don't always get it right. And I tell my students this all the time because I teach bibliotherapy at Queens College. There's so much anxiety around, well, what if I prescribe a book and they hate it? And I'm like, great, hate is an emotion. The goal is to elicit an emotional response. So not every book that's prescribed is going to resonate, but there's still a good bit of information and whatever emotion gets elicited in the reader.
Yeah.
I hope that that makes sense because sometimes my students would be like, well, what if they don't like the book or they don't finish the book? Or it's like, that's great. Then we can explore why, what turned them off about the story arc, what didn't resonate about the narrative or the way that the characters were crafted, right? Like there's juicy psychological information in all of that.
Yeah.
So the goal is just to prescribe a book that's in alignment with the problem and the preferences of a reader, but not necessarily to say like it has to be a book that the reader just loves and finishes from cover to cover. We can work with what we've got.
Yeah, that's great. We always, or I know that I try and tell people if I recommend a book, there is no shame. I have no emotional connection to whether you actually finish it or not. If you don't love it, if it doesn't grab you, don't waste your time on it. There are so many books out there.
Too many books to read, not enough time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's see if I can come up with a little bit of a story here. You mentioned that No Two Persons really touches on grief. There's so much grief, I think, in each of those little vignettes in each of the chapters.
So much, yeah.
Um, what is something that you would recommend for grief, maybe by loss or something more existential or ambiguous than that?
Yeah. Honestly, lately I've been recommending Whoopi Goldberg's memoir so often, Bits and Pieces, My Mother, My Brother, and Me. Whoopi
Okay.
has a few books. So when she came out with this one, I wasn't really sure what would be different about this one. But in this book, she writes about the loss of her mother and her brother. But she starts the story with her being a little girl. So we really understand like why her mother and her brother were so important to her. And just the way that she writes her mother um is such like a master class in like complicated grief, right? Like, because we tend to put people on pedestals after they die, and we're like, well, they were the best person ever. And it's like, maybe they were, but like they weren't perfect, right? But in our grief, we tend to like paint that rosy colored picture. And I think she does such a great job of integrating all of those bits and pieces of like, dang, like things weren't always perfect. And there's a lot that I needed that I didn't get, but there's so much that my mother gave me based off of what she had even with the things that she didn't get. And I just love how this book really helps to honor the relationships that we've had in our lives that even after death, like really still inform who we are, what we value. And I just love Whoopi Goldberg. So I just love her whole style. I really respect and admire her career, and the way that she writes about grief is beautifully healing and honest. I think that's what I would say. It's very emotionally honest. Um, because I always tell my clients where grief is concerned, like there is no like life without grief. Grief is a lifelong process. It's not like you lose someone, you go to therapy, and then boom, you're healed. And then no, because you still life will still go on. You still have to find a way to keep living. You'll grow older and hopefully wiser and integrate some of the lessons, but like there is no life without grief. And we're all gonna be touched by it in some way or many ways. Some of us, when we're younger than others. So I love bits and pieces. Another one is Grief is Love by Marissa. I think it's Renee Lee. Marissa Renee Lee, Grief is Love. Because she also speaks to this piece that like, grief is something, it's like that person that you really didn't want to come over your house, but they came over anyway. And so you're like, okay, come in. And you want them to leave, but they won't leave. But she helps to remind us that like grief is love. If you feel that if you're in that much pain, it's because you are longing for that relationship to be back in its past iteration in the physical, and that's okay. That's a beautiful thing. That's part of integrating um the loss, right? Because I think any great book is honest about the way trauma changes us. It doesn't promise that things are going to go back to the way that they were or that
Yeah.
things will ever be like perfect and packaged up pretty, but it's honest about the way that these life events change us, and it provides us with a hopeful outcome for like what's possible and moving forward. Like healing is always possible. We may not be
Mhm.
able to go back to the past, but we can find a way forward. So I think those are two books that I really love for grief.
Yeah, it captures all the complexity and nuance and messiness, and it's certainly not a linear process. I love just that one word, integration, just making it a
Yeah,
part of yourself and being able to come back to
absolutely.
it over and over again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another one that kind of touches on grief, and I don't want to call anybody in the audience out, but I know that there's some divorce happening. Do you have any
Oh,
recommendations for
wow.
that? Relationships?
That one I wasn't ready for. I'm gonna pull
Oh,
up my
oh, maybe
my
just maybe
library
just
thing.
focus on the relationships part of it.
I do have a list though for divorce.
Ooh,
Hold on.
the major database.
A major database. One of my students told me about library thing, and I love this app.
Oh,
So I've been using it lately to like curate my lists. So there's a few. Hold on. Why isn't it loading? Divorce. I'm able to like uh it's not fully loading.
okay, we can
I'm
come back to it.
sorry.
Yeah,
Well,
what is the database or the app that you're using?
it's it's called Library Thing. I really love it. And it syncs to this Excel spreadsheet that I use. Just Library Thing, one word. You can look it up in the App Store. No One Dies from Divorce is one of my favorite books. It's kind of like self-helpy, but I love the way that she writes about just like how to survive and thrive when your marriage ends. It's one of those books that's like real talk. She doesn't sugarcoat it, but she doesn't make you feel like you're broken because you got divorced. I feel like that's another thing about bibliotherapy is like it's the meaning that we make out of things. And sometimes people want to make you feel ashamed if your marriage fails. And it's like, guess what? Marriages fail for a lot of reasons. And like marriages aren't the only things that fail, right? Like our lungs fail, our legs fail, my knees are failing. I tried to do yoga yesterday and they were cracking. I was like, okay, I need to sit down. So I love books about divorce that are just like, hey, like at the end of the day, things fall apart, which also brings me to another book recommendation for divorce or grief. When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly. Pema
Yeah.
Chodron. Um, When Things Fall Apart, Hard Advice for Difficult Times. I'm reading it now. I love it. I cannot put it down. I'm just like savoring this book and I'm reading it slowly.
Yeah,
I really recommend that book as well.
that's excellent. Yeah, that is classic. How about I know that you have shared your son, you discovered or kind of determined that he was autistic, but it was 2020 when you found out.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's so wonderful that you had the experience and resources that you did, but were there books that helped support you through that process, also learning about neurodivergence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many. So the first that comes to mind for me on my personal journey was We Dare Be Brave, the journey of African American mothers raising children with disabilities. I love that book so much. It's a case study in bibliotherapy in the Bronx because I wanted to show how reading this book led me to be part of a community of Black mothers raising Black sons on the spectrum and changed my life. I went from being like super isolated and just trying to get services during this pandemic where early intervention providers weren't coming to your home at the time, to having this amazing community of women who were nowhere near New York. But because I found them through this book, we ended up developing such strong bonds for our children. So I love that book so much. I love the book Differently Wired too by Deborah Reber because she provides so many tools and resources and she's actually also got an online community that I'm a part of and I've met a lot of really amazing caregivers through her group. I can go on and on about neurodivergent books because that's what I've been mostly reading, as
Yeah.
a parent these days. But those are two that I really love. And A Day with No Words is my son's favorite book. It's a children's book. It's by Tiffany Hammond. Um, and what I love about A Day with No Words is that the protagonist is a non-speaking autistic Black boy who uses assistive technology to communicate. And it's the only book that I found that had an illustration of a child like my son who also uses assistive technology. And he loves that book. He carries it everywhere. I actually have to buy another copy because the pages are falling out of it. But that's the power, right, of like seeing yourself reflected, seeing your story in a book is like, oh my goodness, like there's something that it does to your sense of self-worth to know that your story matters, to know that someone wrote a story where you see I get emotional.
Yeah, it
Because
is
I'll
emotional.
never forget
And
when he
yeah,
first
to know
opened it, I
that you're
could
not
just see
alone
he was
and
like,
develop that community. Yeah, it is incredibly powerful. And I love that he carries it around with him everywhere. I've got books like that too, and they have that prized position on my shelves.
what's the most recent that you've been carrying around with you?
Um, honestly, I've gone back to like 70s feminist literature. And so
I love it.
I think I'm at that age now. The timing is right that those are the places that I go. So
Yeah.
honestly, like Audre Lorde and Eileen Miles and even Patti
Yes.
Smith, she was there in that time, but it's just kind of that perspective. Um, yeah,
Powerful, powerful. I just finished Survival is a Promise. It's based on the life of Audre Lorde.
yeah,
Gorgeous book, a thick one, but a gorgeous one. And it's written by Alexis Pauline.
Gums.
Um, yes. And I want to reread it already. I finished it last week and I'm like, I want to reread it already. That's when you know that you're super fed by book medicine. I
Yeah,
want to like return to it right away.
yeah, that's on my TBR list, and I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm gonna have to go order it now.
Yes, you're gonna love it.
Let's see. Maybe what time do we have? 1:40. I want to ask a selfish question for myself as a training therapist, um, because I am thinking a lot about systems and methods of working with different people, how we are all so affected by family and culture and the conditioning, like the environment that we grow up in. And the more I learn
Yeah.
about bibliotherapy and the more I learn about methods of decolonizing that the whole therapeutic practice, I see so many parallels, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how decolonial bibliotherapy is, right? Because if our clients are reading as a care practice anyway, then what bibliotherapy does is it censors the client and what works for them, and it decensors the therapist as the expert. And I think that's really important because traditional therapy really kind of, how can I put it? It just individualizes the stress. Like if you can't function in today's day and age in this society, then you're the problem. Get with it. You're not high functioning enough. You're not, and that's really harmful. That narrative is really harmful. A lot of us have internalized that narrative. We brought into it, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. So, this idea that like makes our distress and our response to uh, the sickness, the pathology of our society, like a personal shortcoming, rather than honestly regarding it as a response to systemic oppression. Um, that's what the creative arts therapies do. Um, it really makes us face the fact of how we've been culturally displaced. It makes us face how historical trauma affects the present day. That we don't exist in a vacuum either, that like all of our destinies are interconnected and that we're responsible for each other. Um, and so I think, bibliotherapy really and other creative arts therapies really disrupts that narrative by like validating the realities of colonialism, racism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, right? All of those societal um, forces that affect our mental health. And I love how it's not just providing us with that societal mirror and those truths, but by connecting to other people's stories, not only can we face the truth, but we can also face like our agency and realize that like we may not be able to control everything, but there are things that we do have control for, which is why like hearing you say I'm drawn to reading feminist texts from the 70s, it's like, yeah, because what were women going through then, right? They were really tapping into their power, agency, and collective unity and how that shifted things in our world. And so I think a lot of people right now are feeling that way. Like I'm getting a lot of people coming to me who are like rereading Parable of the Sower, right? Like Octavia Butler, lots of questions around like, well, was she prophetic or was she just someone who was in tune with the times and was able to see, hey, if we keep going down this trajectory, this is what's going to happen to humanity, So I think we're drawn to books that really ground us. Um, in those realities, and that's one of the goals actually of clinical bibliotherapy is to improve reality orientation. And so this is where it's dangerous to try to like all this banning of books and pushing, erasing diverse voices because that's very intentional, right? To make it seem like, well, people aren't really oppressed. And it's it's really mind-blowing how effective some of these efforts are to silence voices. And now with, we know where we're headed because we're all in it right now.
Yeah.
But I think when we remember that mental health is a collective thing, not an individual thing, and we can have conversations with each other, whether that be in a book club or at work with our families and friends, like we realize that we do have more power than we're often told that we have. There's a lot that gets told to us that just simply isn't true. And there's so much strength in humanity and beauty in humanity. And I think connecting to stories helps us remember that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Healing and community. Um,
Yeah,
let's go
yeah.
back to those prescriptions then. I mentioned generational trauma before. Was there anything on your list for recognizing those patterns and those systems and how they affect us?
Yes, I have a whole list of books on generational trauma. More recently, Decolonizing Therapy by Dr. Jennifer Mullen is a go-to text for me right now. Break the Cycle by Dr. Marielle Bouquet, phenomenal book that, oh, I see it on your shelf.
I was trying to
Shout
pull it,
out
but
to,
everything's in a crumple.
yes, shout out to Dr. Mullen. Break the Cycle by Dr. Maria Bouquet, a Dominican psychologist. She wrote an amazing book that really lifts up cycle breakers in our communities and in our families, the people who realize, like, wow, we're stuck in these generational patterns that haven't been serving us, emotional wounds that keep getting acted out and passed down. There's someone in every lineage that says no, the buck stops here. And what I love about that is reading her book really affirms not just that you are a cycle breaker, but what breaking cycles will require of you. And then she gives you practical tools and frameworks to apply. So I love that book so much. I recommend it to everybody. Matter of fact, buy it after this talk, y'all, because you're gonna be glad that you did.
This is so wonderful. I was trying to keep up with all the titles, but I've lost it now. I'm going to depend on the the recording. Um, okay, so we're getting close to time. I want to give you, well, actually, I want to ask you, is there anything else that's on your mind right now that you feel called to share right now with us in this space?
Yes. It's actually a quote from those two persons that I wanted to share during my initial like mini intro to bibliotherapy because I love when the professor says to Alice, so should I just read it?
Sure.
Okay, so I guess so Professor Robert says, I think each story has its own life. In the beginning, it lives in the writer's mind and it grows and changes while it's there. Changes the writer too, I bet. He smiled at her and then continued. At some point, it's written down, and that's the book readers hold in their hands. But the story isn't done because it goes on to live in the reader's minds in a way that's particular to each of them. We're all caretakers of the stories, Alice. Writers are just the lucky ones that get to know them first. It was an interesting concept, but Alice wasn't sure she agreed. Maybe because she had thought back when she heard that author speak in elementary school, back when she was learning the tricks of a good sentence or scene, that the books she'd write would stay somehow separate from her, perfect, beautiful worlds she could hold in her hands, easily passed on to be admired. She hadn't expected this story, this one that felt like a heartbeat. I don't know, she said. And this is the part that I wanted to share with everyone to leave everybody with today. What is a story if we don't tell it? Professor Roberts asked. A secret, she thought. And Alice knew what a secret could do to you. So I'm sharing that to say we are so conditioned to not only think about like the stories that our society tries to erase, and the pressures of like fighting, right, against book banning and fighting against that. But we're also conditioned to believe that there's certain stories that we shouldn't tell, that are too shameful. We don't talk about that. And I just want to encourage everybody that's here today to tell your story. Don't let anyone make you feel like you shouldn't tell your truth. You lived it. You're living it. This is your experience. And I get emotional because I know how much it took for me to write down some of the stories in bibliotherapy in the Bronx. And Megan, talk about shadow work, okay? Whew. And I know that not everyone is going to resonate with my story because it's not going to be everyone's experience. Some people will be more empathetic than others if they come from different lived experiences, but I still needed to tell it for myself. And also because down the line, once that book is in the world, somebody will find it who needs it at the right time and it will help them to heal. So don't be ashamed of your truth, your story. I'm so glad that you're here to tell your story. Take advantage of the fact that you have your voice. Lift up your voice and share your story because we want to hear it. We want to hear it. And if you have a book and you think that I need to know about it, I would love to support you. Email me, send me a copy. I will amplify your work on Literacy NYC. I do not charge for, book features. My main concern is making sure that we pair the right people with the right books at the right time because stories are medicine and you have a story that's medicine that needs to be told. And that's all. That's the last thing I needed to say.
Well, that's incredibly powerful, and this time has been absolutely magical. Would you like to, I want to make sure that you have time to talk a little bit more about your book before we jump to questions for the last few minutes.
Yeah, yeah. So bibliotherapy in the Bronx, it's my life's work. It's my work as a Black American Puerto Rican bibliotherapist from New York. In it, I share a bit of my personal story. I talk about how I came to this work. I am the daughter of two teen parents. My parents had their own struggles. My grandmother raised me and then ended up passing away suddenly when I was 14. I went into foster care. Luckily enough, the way life would have it, I ended up getting a full scholarship, going to college, studying abroad in England my junior year, learning about bibliotherapy, going to social work school for grad school, and becoming a bibliotherapist. And so I talk about this modality as not only healing in my own life, but the way that I help others heal through stories. This is a resource as well as a guide for therapists, for librarians, for educators who are on the front line. I always say, teachers, librarians, y'all are mental health interventionists and you're already doing bibliotherapy. So my book is really just celebrating that and talking about the unique way that I do it. At the end of each chapter, you'll have some many creative interventions that you can make your own if you're someone who's using bibliotherapy in your libraries or in your schools or even just in your practice as a reader. So that was my goal with this book, to make it accessible, to make it real, to celebrate the stories of those who have multi-marginalized experiences. I want people to walk away from this book feeling seen and held and validated and empowered. And I'm really hoping that there will be a new wave of diverse bibliotherapists who read this book and apply it to their personal and professional practice. So I'm excited, really, really excited about it. And I hope that I can come to all the places and do all the things. So invite me if you have a classroom, if you're doing something at your library, I want to come. I'm most likely able to do virtual events more than in person, because I've got two little ones and a child with a disability, but I'm trying to just like show up because this is a community book. And so I want to celebrate it in community. And that's really what I'm trying to do with bibliotherapy in the Bronx.
It's wonderful. April 29th, everybody. Um,
April
all right.
29th, y'all. Oh, and
Let's
it's
just,
available on Spotify. So you can
oh,
pre-save it on Spotify. The audiobook will be narrated by Wesley Shaban. I love her voice. She narrated Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan, one of my favorite books. So I'm glad that I got her because I couldn't narrate it myself. But at least I got the narrator that I wanted. So I'm really excited about that as well.
yeah, that's a big deal. All right, let's do some questions.
Okay.
There's a question about thought hygiene, I think from the very beginning. Could you expand on what thought hygiene is?
Absolutely. So, we're human beings. We've got thoughts that come in and out of our mind all the time, and we don't always choose our thoughts. Sometimes thoughts just happen. It's like having a lucid dream, and you're like, whoa, that was a little bit weird, and you wake up all disoriented. And as a therapist, I found that sometimes it's really hard for clients to just like get still enough to pay attention to their thoughts. Because that's the thing. Just because you have a thought doesn't mean that you chose that thought, you mean that thought, or that thought says anything about you. Perfect example that I like to share. One time I was working with a postpartum mother who was extremely depressed, and she would just come to my sessions and just cry, cry, cry. And finally, one day I asked her, I said, can you try to just like put it into words for me to help, like give me an in so we can talk about the thing that's ailing you? And she's like, I just can't say it. I'd be so embarrassed. You're going to judge me. I said, I'm not going to, I promise. And told her some crazy things that go on in my head. And she started laughing. And I'm like, just tell me what the thought was. And she was like, okay. I was walking down the stairs. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just had this thought, like, what if I just throw my baby down the stairs? And I was like, yeah. And she was like she was surprised I didn't judge her. I'm like, yes, every mother has that thought when you've gone 4 days with no sleep and you have a screaming infant and you're home alone, right? And your whole life has changed and you're healing after birth. That's not uncommon. And you could just see Megan, the relief. She was like, okay, I'm not a horrible mom. But the work that it took for that client just to tell me
Yeah.
that thought. She was so ashamed. She created a whole story in her head about being a murderous, horrible mother. And I said to her, have you ever thrown your infant down the stairs? No, right? Okay. So, like, it's one thing to have the thought, and it's another thing to do the thing. You're not a horrible mother. You're just a mother. And I can promise you, Other mothers have these thoughts. I'm a therapist, trust me, I hear it all the time, and I'm a mother, so like I get it.
Yeah.
And so when I talk about thought hygiene, that's what I'm talking about. Is like don't create a story in your head, making you out to be like a villain or a bad person. First of all, we're human, so yes, we have dark thoughts. But ultimately it's less about what you think and more about your behavior, right? Like what are you doing with those thoughts? Because sometimes what we do is we repress a feeling that we don't want to feel. It's too painful, but that feeling is still there. So if thoughts are coming up that feel really dark, it's because that feeling needs to be witnessed. You need to offer yourself some compassion. And that's another reason why I love reading, because a lot of times when we're reading, we can feel those shadow feelings. I hate a character. I can be really envious of a character. And it's not, there's nobody judging me that's like reading my thoughts to be like, Emily, you're a horrible person because you have that thought. No, we get to be as petty, as awful as we want to be, and just have an emotional spectrum of experiences while we're reading without social judgment or self-judgment, right? And that's mental health. So I could go on about thought hygiene because there's many different ways that cognitive thinking errors affect our mental health, right? Catastrophizing, black and white thinking. We can go on and that's really what I mean when I talk about thought hygiene. Just being able to sit with your thoughts, look at your thoughts, consider them. This is why modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, these are modalities that help clients to turn inward, to just like look at your thought life. And is that true? Is that your thought? Is that a thought that maybe you grew up in a family system where that was like upheld, but that's not really what you believe? We have
Mhm.
to be able to engage our thoughts to know. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Find out what's authentically ours rather than what's come from some other direction in our life. Um, I
Right,
think I think
right.
we've kind of touched on a few others of these. We have one in the Q&A. You did touch on the writing part of your practice. Could you expand on it a little bit more for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So expressive writing is a major component of bibliotherapy, not only getting clients to read text and emotionally engage with text, but to respond in creative ways. Um, and so this could look different ways. Sometimes when I was a school social worker, I did a lot of this, but I still do this with adult clients as well. Write a letter to a character, expressing what you have to say to them. Rewrite the ending of a story that you loved, but maybe you hated the ending and you were hoping for a different outcome. You can also do this in different ways, like for your personal healing practice. Write a letter to your long lost pet, right? Who you miss. Write a letter to your inner child. Um, Write a poem in response to one line of dialogue that really activated you emotionally, right? So it's really about engaging in a writing exercise, a creative writing exercise that allows you to experience some insight, some catharsis around the text that you've read. And there's a lot of fun ways that that could look.
Wonderful. Let me see here, maybe one more, and then we will be at the end of our time. Um, Somebody asked about music therapy and how it's comparable. Maybe somebody that listens to the same song over and over again for days on end.
Absolutely. So poetry therapist John Leedy actually writes about this in his work. He founded the Poetry Therapy Center in New York City in the 70s. He writes about I think it's called the isotone principle or the ISO principle in music therapy as being similar to bibliotherapy. So the same thing around like right book at the right time, the right song at the right time, right? We've all been there. We're like, I think about it with like teenage angst. Like you go through a horrible breakup and you think your life is over. You just have that song on repeat, even though you're 14 and you'll be okay. But like in that moment, you're like, I'll never find another love. So sometimes you just hear a song and it's expressing the emotion that you need to release, and you experience a release through listening. Same principle applies to bibliotherapy.
This has been absolutely beautiful. I feel so honored to have been able to be the one in conversation with you today, and I think that everybody feels privileged to have been here with us.
I'm
Thank you
so
so much.
honored to be here with all of you, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. And listen, I want to like take a sneak peek into your bookshelf, so you gotta give me some prescriptions later. I'll be
I'll
emailing you.
send you a snapshot.
For sure. Thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you, Emily.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both. I have just been sitting here like everybody else in this event. I've just been soaking it all up and loving it. And I've been writing down all the titles. So I'll send a follow-up email to everybody who's here that has a list of the titles that were mentioned today. Um, Although I missed the title and the author, it was the last book I think that you talked about. It was the book that you talked about after decolonizing therapy.
Oh, Break the Cycle. It
Thank you.
is Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma by Dr. Marielle Bouquet.
Thank you. That was
You're welcome.
you were saying how very important that one was to you, and I want to make sure we got that one. Um,
Yeah.
Gosh, so much I personally am taking away from this, and I'm very grateful. So thank you, and so many nice things are being said in the chat. Everybody's just really, it's been very powerful, very impactful, and we appreciate it. And Megan, thank you for asking your thoughtful questions. That was wonderful. Everybody, please go out and buy a copy or pre-order a copy of Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, or check it out from your library. I have specially requested that Whatcom County Library System is going to have a copy of that book in our collection, so you can go ahead and put a hold on it as soon as it arrives. So as a reminder, this was a Whatcom Reads event, and we love to know how we're doing, how we can improve, and what we're doing well. So I am putting a link in the chat to our evaluation, our online evaluation form. Is if anybody here has a minute to just quickly fill out that online form, we would be very grateful. And speaking of grateful, thank you, ladies. This was very special. And
You.
I think I think that's it. We can enjoy the sunshine
I was
now.
gonna say I wish I was where y'all are so I could take my book outside. It's getting late here in Massachusetts. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day. And thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.